Yes. The long-range strategy is what it says. It's a long-range strategy. It took years to come to fruition. There are a number of reasons for this. They had to allow, for example, those with memories of the Stalin repressions to die off. They had to ensure that the true opposition no longer existed, and they have liquidated all true opposition in all East European
in all communist countries.
Which means, with a few exceptions.
Which means, as Golitsyn has pointed out, then that and those deceptions are subject to question. Those exceptions are subject to question.
Yes, even those.
But when we see a supposed dissident movement within a communist or so-called former communist state, having access to the media, operating openly, having resources, and being able to express itself and be heard around the world, it would immediately be suspect of being a KGB front operation, at least in terms of its leadership.
Absolutely correct.
Yes.
And as a result of the what Gorbachev first of all launches Perestroika internally, and when the softening up process has been completed, i.e. the West is attuned to the fact that there's been this apparent reform and that it's all falling apart, they then export Perestroika to the whole world. So that in fact what has happened is that you have, instead of having walk-ins, defectors arriving and knocking on the West door, you've got a mass walk-in, so that no one knows who's genuine and who isn't.
To go back just a bit regarding Golitsyn defecting to the American CIA in the early 1960s, he had an advocate in James Angleton, and the influence of what Golitsyn revealed was felt through Angleton's policies. But that came to an end in 1974 when Angleton was fired by CIA Director William Colby after Golitsyn had warned that there were Soviet moles, Soviet agents within the CIA at high levels. To what extent was Golitsyn vindicated by the Aldrich Ames exposure?
Totally. I mean, Golitsyn has been telling everybody since he finished the first book, New Lies for Old, which actually he finished in 1980, although it was only published in 1984, that the CIA was penetrated. This was obvious from internal evidence. Now, of course, with the Ames case, that is proved. I mean, everybody knows that there are many more moles inside Western intelligence than just Ames, but Ames is a symptom of the penetration of the Central Intelligence Agency.
In the book, as you said, written in 1980, published in 1984, Golitsyn's New Lies for Old, he revealed not only this massive disinformation strategy, which goes back to 1959, and the ramifications of it, the applications of it during the 1960s, 1970s, but he made a series, the book was published in '84, he made a series of incredible predictions regarding what was going to come as a result of this strategy, and the predictions are just amazing to read. Would you go over some of them?
Well, I mean, there are 3 or 4 pages which are just chock-a-block full of predictions. He talks about the removal of the Berlin Wall, liberalization starting in East Germany and spreading to the rest of Eastern Europe. He says, for example, that Dubček will be restored in Czechoslovakia, which duly happened for a brief period. And he talks about a reconciliation with the West and the reunification of Germany and so on and so forth. And in a recent book published by written by Mark Riebling, called Wedge, The Secret War Between the FBI and CIA, published in 1994, Riebling carries out a careful analysis of Golitsyn's predictions in New Lies for Old, and he established that out of 148 falsifiable predictions, 139 had been verified by 1993. Now that, and he gave him an accuracy rating of over 94%. That is without parallel in the West. I mean, this puts Golitsyn in a separate category from everybody. Now, I think,
in other words, if Golitsyn is not telling, the truth about
everybody has to explain why these predictions were correct.
If he's not telling the truth about the fact that all that we have witnessed since 1989 was planned as Soviet disinformation strategy, going back this far, then he has to be a prophet. He just has to be a clairvoyant.
Either he has to have supernatural powers.
He has to have supernatural powers.
Or
yes.
he has to understand Soviet strategy.
That's right.
And of course the answer is the latter.
Yes.
He understands Soviet strategy because he knows that it's based on the thinking of Lenin. He's studied Lenin. Now, one of the things that I've done in the last few years is go back to Lenin and try to read and understand what this evil man is saying.
Mm-hmm.
He's actually preaching hatred. He's preaching how to deceive, and he's teaching us how to deceive. And Lenin's disciples remain in control of the world communist movement. Mm-hmm. All they've done is relabeled themselves mm-hmm. in order to appear acceptable to the West. There's a passage in Lenin where he says that there may come a time in the revolution when true revolutionaries must put on the appearance and the clothing and the manner and the language of the enemy. Mm-hmm. And this is what they've done. So that, and it's very easy to see that this is the case once one understands that this is what's going on. If you take someone like Andrei Kozyrev, the Russian foreign minister, you can see mm-hmm. that everything he says is a deception. Mm-hmm. He is an absolute, he's the most brilliant mm-hmm. representative of the Leninist case currently operating. He's the son, incidentally, of one of the Soviet diplomats who were kicked out of London by the Douglas Hume government in 1972.
There is a description in New Lies for Old of a new liberal or more democratic figure who would emerge as the leader of the Soviet Union. Sure. That is a mirror image of Mikhail Gorbachev.
Yes.
Now tell us about Mikhail Gorbachev and perhaps his apparently more credible, at least in the eyes of the world and the media, successor Boris Yeltsin. Did they ever show any trace of interest in democratic reform?
Well, what they did show an interest in was in the continuation of their Leninist strategy.
Yes,
I mean,
exactly.
the important point about Gorbachev is that, as in the case of Hitler and Mein Kampf, he clearly and repeatedly laid down in black and white, in speeches and in his book Perestroika, what he was doing. He made it quite clear what he was doing. In Perestroika, he said, we went back to Lenin, we reviewed Lenin, we took inspiration from Lenin, and we based our strategy on Lenin. So when I was asked by Mrs. Thatcher, as she then was, to see her in the House of Commons in July 1991 to explain these matters to her, I was completely flabbergasted when she said to me, I don't think Gorbachev is a Leninist anymore. And then she also said, I don't think we've been deceived, at least I hope we haven't. Mm-hmm. So I was, in fact, that was the real turning point in the later part of my life. That was when I realized I should spend basically most of my time mm-hmm. trying to explain how she was conned. Mm-hmm. And how wrong she was. Of course, it's very simple to do. You can show from Gorbachev's speeches, from his writings, that in fact he was constantly quoting Lenin. He is and was a key advocate of the Leninist world revolution. And of course, he remains so to this day. Mm-hmm. Gorbachev, as you probably know, is in charge of the so-called Gorbachev Foundation, which various experts led by Hans Graf Hune, a well-known German expert, have identified as, in fact, the international department of the CPSU. And it's based here in San Francisco.
Communist Party, Soviet Union.
Yes.
Yes.
The international department of the CPSU was, in fact, the Comintern. Mm-hmm. So the Gorbachev Foundation, based in the Presidio in San Francisco, is, in fact, the Comintern. Mm-hmm. And what Gorbachev is in charge of is influencing the Western elite. And in fact, the key elite, of course, is based here. This is the elite that he has to influence, mm-hmm. which is what he's been doing ever since he arrived with a large delegation in Washington in 1987.
That's right. And his opponent, or his political rival, or his the opposition, the quote-unquote opposition he faced, Boris Yeltsin, comes from the same Leninist background.
Oh, no question. I mean, Boris Yeltsin was awarded the Order of Lenin. He was a Communist Party chief. He could not possibly have risen mm-hmm. to the level that he did in the structures without being approved at the highest level. I mean, no one can can move without approval.
Well, now, looking at the reality of what exists today in the light of the predictions Galitzin made in New Lies for Old, we see that, as he predicted, the Soviet Union and its power and control over its republics, separate republics, and satellite nations still continues through the same KGB and leaden bureaucracies that have simply been given new names, but that are still in place, fully in place.
The so-called independence of the Soviet republics is false and provisional. It's based on Lenin's fake Far Eastern Republic, which he set up in the late 1920s. And their purpose, the existence of these republics, has been brought about for a number of strategic reasons. I mean, at a fairly low level, one of the most important reasons is that the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and all the international institutions have been penetrated by